The church was packed, filled with the soft hum of an organ and the smell of expensive flowers. For any mother, watching her son get married is a big deal. It is a moment filled with joy and a few tears. But for Eleanor, sitting in the front row, the happiness was mixed with a strange, cold feeling in her stomach. She was wearing a simple navy blue dress that she had bought at a department store. It was modest and respectful. In contrast, the bride's family, the Van Cleves, looked like they had stepped out of a fashion magazine. The mother of the bride, Cynthia, was dripping in diamonds and wore a dress that probably cost more than Eleanor's car. Eleanor had tried hard to get along with them. From the moment David, her son, introduced Vanessa, the bride, there had been tension. Vanessa came from a wealthy family, or at least that is what they wanted everyone to believe. They often made little comments about Eleanor's small house, her old car, and the fact that she lived on a pension. Eleanor usually just smiled and ignored it, telling herself that as long as David was happy, nothing else mattered. But today, on the wedding day, the mean-spirited jokes were getting harder to swallow. The ceremony was beautiful. David stood at the altar, looking incredibly handsome in his tuxedo. His face was glowing with love. He was staring at Vanessa as if she were the only person in the world. Vanessa, on the other hand, seemed more focused on the audience and the cameras. She posed for photos even as she walked down the aisle. When they reached the altar, the priest began the vows. Everything seemed perfect until it was time for the ring exchange. Vanessa turned a hand, her bouquet of flowers to her maid of honor. It was a normal thing for a bride to do. But as she handed the flowers over, she leaned in close to the maid of honor. She didn't whisper quietly. She spoke loud enough for the people in the first row to hear her voice clearly over the quiet church music. "Finally, I can get rid of this cheap bouquet," Vanessa said with a giggle that echoed slightly. "And look at that," she continued, nodding her head ever so slightly toward Eleanor. "I finally get to ditch the cheap polyester and join a family with actual class. Good riddance to the peasant section. I can't wait to burn this dress and pretend I never knew people like that." The words hit Eleanor like a bucket of ice water. She froze. She looked around to see if anyone else had heard. A few people in the row behind her shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Someone gasped softly. Vanessa's mother, Cynthia, was sitting right beside Eleanor. Instead of looking shocked or apologizing, Cynthia put a hand over her mouth to hide a smirk. She looked at her husband, Vanessa's father, and they shared a look that said, "Well, it's true, isn't it?" David, standing at the altar, was facing the priest. He had no idea what his new wife had just said about his mother. He was smiling, waiting to say, "I do." Eleanor felt her heart break, not just because of the insult, but because of the cruelty. This wasn't just a bride being stressed. This was a woman who genuinely looked down on the family she was marrying into. And the worst part was that she was doing it in a holy place, in front of God and everyone. Right before promising to love and honor, Eleanor gripped her purse tightly. Her knuckles turned white. For years, she had raised David on her own, working double shifts to put food on the table. She taught him to be kind, humble, and respectful of everyone. She had taught him that money doesn't make a person good. Now, the woman he was about to marry was mocking everything he stood for, and she was doing it with a smile on her face. Eleanor looked at Cynthia again. Cynthia was adjusting her diamond necklace, looking bored. The entire Van Cleve family acted like they were royalty, and that everyone else was just there to serve them. Eleanor remembered the lunch they had last week, where Vanessa's father had made a joke about common people not understanding good wine. At the time, Eleanor laughed it off, thinking they were just eccentric. Now, sitting in the church, she realized it wasn't a joke. It was who they were. She looked back at David. He was so in love. He thought Vanessa was a princess. If Eleanor stood up and caused a scene right now, she would ruin her son's wedding day. She would humiliate him in front of hundreds of guests. But if she sat there and took it, she was letting them walk all over her dignity. She felt tears stinging her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry as the priest pronounced them husband and wife. The congregation stood up to cheer. Vanessa beamed, waving to the crowd like a celebrity on a red carpet. She took David's arm, and they walked back down the aisle. As they passed the row where Eleanor was sitting, Vanessa looked directly at her. There was no smile of welcome. There was a cold, hard look in her eyes that dared Eleanor to say something. It was a look of victory. She thought she had one. She thought she had the son, the money, and the status. And she didn't have to pretend to respect the mother anymore. Eleanor stood up slowly. She felt small in that moment, but then a wave of anger washed over her. It started in her toes and rose up until her back was straight and her head was held high. She watched them walk away, followed by Cynthia and the rest of the Van Cleve family, who were acting like they owned the church. "I won't let this go," Eleanor whispered to herself. "You think you can mock me in my life? You think you can treat my son like a trophy? We will see about that." She waited for the church to empty out a bit before she started walking toward the exit. The guests were heading to the reception hall next door for dinner and dancing. They were all smiling and chatting, unaware of the poison that had just been spilled at the altar. Eleanor stopped at the back of the church. She looked at a statue near the door, taking a deep breath to calm her racing heart. She knew something that the Van Cleves didn't know. They thought she was just a sweet old lady with no power. They thought because she didn't wear diamonds or drive a fancy car, she was stupid. But Eleanor wasn't just a mother. She used to work in a very serious job before she retired. She knew how to find the truth. She knew how to read people, and she knew how to find secrets. For the last few months, ever since she started getting a bad feeling about Vanessa's family, she had been quietly doing some digging. She hadn't told David about it because she didn't want to worry him. She wanted to be wrong. But the cruelty she had just heard at the altar confirmed her suspicions. This wasn't about class. It was about character. And the Van Cleves had no character. Eleanor touched her bag, where she kept a small notebook and her phone. She had information. She had proof that the perfect rich family was a fake. They were living a lie, spending money they didn't have to impress people they didn't even like. Eleanor walked out of the church into the fresh evening air. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the wedding guests. Everyone was happy, celebrating the union of two families. But Eleanor knew the truth. The union was a sham. As she walked toward her car, parked far away from the expensive limousines, she made a decision. She would go to the reception, and she would smile, and she would eat her dinner. But she wouldn't go home and cry. She had work to do. The mask was coming off, and Eleanor was the one who was going to tear it away. The war had just begun, and she was ready to fight for her son, even if he didn't know he needed saving yet. The reception hall was buzzing with life. Soft music played in the background, and the clinking of glasses filled the air. Waiters in black vests moved around the room carrying silver trays with fancy appetizers. Everyone seemed to be having a wonderful time, laughing and chatting about how beautiful the bride was and how romantic the ceremony had been. But for Eleanor, the noise was like a hammer hitting her head. She sat at a table near the back watching the celebration unfold. But her mind was racing a mile a minute. She could see David and Vanessa at the head table. They were cutting the massive multi-tiered wedding cake. Vanessa was laughing loudly, posing for the photographer, making sure the diamond on her finger caught the light perfectly. David looked happy, but there was a slight look of confusion on his face whenever he looked down at his mother's empty table. Eleanor had barely touched her food. She just couldn't bring herself to eat. The comment Vanessa had made at the altar was still burning in her ears. It felt like a bad dream that she couldn't wake up from. Cynthia, Vanessa's mother, walked by Eleanor's table. She didn't stop to say hello. She just gave a little nod, a smug look on her face, as if she knew exactly how Eleanor was feeling. It made Eleanor's blood boil. These people thought they were better than everyone else. They thought they could walk all over people because they had money and nice things. But Eleanor knew something they didn't. She knew that looks can be deceiving. Eleanor stood up slowly. Her legs felt a bit shaky, not from weakness, but from the adrenaline pumping through her body. She needed to get out of there. She needed to breathe. She walked over to David's table. He was mid-conversation with one of Vanessa's uncles, but when he saw his mother, he stopped immediately. "Mom?" David asked, his face full of concern. "Is everything okay? You look really pale." "You haven't eaten anything," Eleanor forced a smile. It wasn't a real smile, but it was the best she could manage. "I'm fine, David. Just a bit of a migraine, I think. The lights and the noise are a little too much for me right now. I'm going to step out to my car to get some fresh air and maybe take a pill. I'll be back in a little while." David looked relieved. He thought she was just feeling sick. "Oh, okay. Don't worry about us. Go rest. We have to do the first dance in an hour, so come back if you can. But if not, I understand." "I love you, Mom. Love you too, sweetie," Eleanor said, squeezing his hand. She wanted to warn him right then and there. She wanted to grab him by the shoulders and tell him that his new wife was a cruel person. But she knew David. He was kind and trusting. If she accused Vanessa without proof, he would just think she was being emotional or jealous. She needed hard evidence. She needed facts that Vanessa couldn't lie her way out of. Eleanor walked out of the banquet hall, leaving the party behind her. The cool evening air hit her face, and she took a deep breath. She walked quickly across the parking lot to her car. It was an older model, a bit scratched up, but it was reliable. It was paid for, which was more than she could say for the Van Cleve's fancy cars. She got into the driver's seat and locked the doors. The silence inside the car was a huge relief. She opened her glove compartment. It was messy, filled with napkins and old sunglasses. But she pushed all that aside until she found what she was looking for, a thick, manila folder. Most people think of grandmothers as sweet ladies who bake cookies and knit sweaters. But before Eleanor retired, she had a very different life. She had worked as a legal assistant for a law firm that handled fraud cases. She spent 30 years looking at documents, finding lies, and catching people who tried to cheat the system. She knew how to follow a paper trail better than anyone. And for the past month, she had been using those old skills on the Van Cleve. Family had started when Cynthia made a comment about how expensive their new vacation home in the mountains was. She bragged about it nonstop. But something didn't sit right with Eleanor. She knew that Cynthia's husband didn't work a steady job. He called himself an investor, but he never seemed to go to an office. So, Eleanor started digging. She opened the folder on her lap. It was filled with printouts. There were copies of public court records, bankruptcy filings, and property tax documents. She had spent hours at the library and online, searching through public databases. It wasn't hard to find if you knew where to look. The Van Cleves were broke. Not just tight on cash, but completely drowning in debt. The vacation home Cynthia bragged about wasn't owned by them. It was being rented for the summer to impress people, and the rent was 3 months past due. The family estate they talked about had been foreclosed on by the bank 2 years ago. They were currently living in a house that was owned by a relative, basically squatting there for free. Eleanor flipped through the pages, her anger growing with every document. There were photos she had printed from social media, showing Vanessa wearing expensive designer dresses. But Eleanor had found the receipts for those dresses on a resale site. Vanessa was buying the clothes, wearing them once for a photo shoot, and then returning them or selling them as new online to unsuspecting buyers. And then there was the worst part. David had a trust fund. It wasn't a huge amount, but it was money left to him by his grandparents. It was enough for a down payment on a house or to start a family. The Van Cleves didn't know about the exact amount yet, but they knew it existed. Eleanor was convinced that this wedding was a trap. They wanted Vanessa to marry David so they could get their hands on that money to pay off their massive gambling debts. She looked at a particular paper, court notice, dated just last month. It was a summons for Vanessa's father regarding a Ponzi scheme. He was being sued for taking money from old people and promising them high returns, only to spend the money on himself. It made Eleanor sick to her stomach. These people weren't just snobs. They were criminals. And they were targeting her son. Eleanor took a deep breath. She had to calm down. Getting angry wouldn't help David. She needed a plan. She couldn't just barge back into the reception and start shouting. That would make her look crazy, and David would be embarrassed. She had to do this the right way. She had to expose them in a way that they couldn't recover from. A way that would open David's eyes instantly. She looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror. She saw a tired older woman with gray hair and worry lines. But behind those eyes, there was a fire. She wasn't just a mother. She was a protector. She had spent her whole life protecting David from bullies at school, from bad grades, from heartbreak. This was just the biggest bully he had ever faced. Eleanor organized the papers back into the folder. She pulled out a small stack of index cards. She had written down a speech. She had rehearsed it in her bathroom mirror a dozen times, hoping she would never have to use it. She had prayed that Vanessa was just a bit shallow, maybe a bit spoiled, but not actually evil. But the comment at the altar had proved her wrong. You don't mock someone's mother at their own wedding if you have a good heart. She looked at the clock on the dashboard. She had been gone for 20 minutes. The speeches would be starting soon. The best man would speak, then the maid of honor. Then, traditionally, the mother of the groom could speak if she wanted to. Usually, Eleanor would say a few nice words about love and happiness. Tonight would be different. Eleanor applied a fresh coat of lipstick. She fixed her hair. She didn't want to look like a victim when she walked back in there. She wanted to look like a force to be reckoned with. She picked up the folder and hid it under her jacket. She felt the weight of it against her side. It was heavy, but it was the weight of the truth. They think they are so clever, Eleanor whispered to herself. They think they can wear fancy clothes and tell lies, and no one will ever check. But they forgot one thing. You should never underestimate a mother who loves her son. She opened the car door and stepped back out into the night. The air felt cooler now, sharper. She walked back toward the brightly lit reception hall. From the outside, it looked like a fairy tale. There were lights strung up in the trees and people were laughing on the patio. But Eleanor knew that inside that beautiful bubble, a snake was lurking. As she reached the doors, she heard the sound of the best man finishing his toast. The guests cheered and clapped. Eleanor took a deep breath, put her hand on the door handle, and pushed it open. She wasn't just going back to a party. She was walking into a battle. And for the first time all night, she wasn't afraid. She was ready. The heavy wooden doors of the banquet hall swung open, and the noise of the party rushed out to meet Eleanor. It was a wall of sound laughter, the clinking of silverware, and the upbeat rhythm of a pop song playing on the speakers. For a second, she paused in the doorway. The air inside was warm and smelled of roasted chicken, vanilla cake, and expensive perfume. It was the smell of a celebration, but to Eleanor it felt like she was walking into a trap. She tightened her grip on the folder hidden under her jacket. It felt heavy against her side, a physical reminder of the truth she was carrying. She walked across the room, trying to look as normal as possible. She didn't want to draw attention to herself yet. Guests smiled at her as she passed, probably thinking she was just coming back from a rest. Some people nodded politely. They had no idea what was about to happen. They saw a happy wedding and a proud mother. They didn't see the storm clouds gathering. Eleanor made her way back to her table. She sat down and took a sip of water to wet her dry throat. She looked toward the front of the room. The head table was a long, raised platform covered in white cloth and pink flowers. David and Vanessa were sitting in the middle like a king and queen on a throne. Vanessa was leaning toward David, whispering something in his ear. She was giggling, twirling a lock of her hair around her finger. David was listening intently, a lovesick grin on his face. It broke Eleanor's heart all over again. He trusted her completely. He had no idea that the woman sitting next to him had just mocked his own mother in front of God and everyone. Just then, the music stopped. The DJ tapped the microphone, causing a squeal of feedback that made everyone wince. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please. The DJ's voice boomed through the speakers. It is now time for the parents to share a few words. We've heard from the best man, and now, the mother of the groom, Eleanor, has requested the microphone. A ripple of applause went through the room. David clapped the loudest, looking over at his mother with a proud smile. He had no idea she had requested this time slot earlier in the day. Eleanor stood up slowly. She smoothed down the front of her navy blue dress. Her legs felt like lead, but she forced them to move. She walked toward the stage, her eyes fixed on the white curtain behind the DJ. She couldn't look at David yet. If she looked at his trusting face, she might lose her nerve. She climbed the 3 steps up to the stage. The DJ handed her the microphone. It felt cold and heavy in her hand. She looked out at the sea of faces. There were hundreds of people, their friends, neighbors, distant relatives, and the Van Cleves' rich friends. Everyone was smiling, expecting a sweet, maybe slightly boring speech about how love conquers all. Cynthia, Vanessa's mother, was sitting at a table right near the front. She took a sip of her wine and whispered something to the man sitting next to her, rolling her eyes. She clearly expected Eleanor to say something simple and common. Eleanor cleared her throat. The feedback squealed again, silencing the last few whispers in the room. "Good evening, everyone," Eleanor began. Her voice was steady, but quiet. She didn't shout. She spoke into the microphone with a calm, soft tone that forced people to lean in and listen. "For those of you who don't know me, I am David's mother. I want to start by saying how handsome my son looks tonight and how beautiful the bride is." She paused, looking directly at Vanessa. "Vanessa, you look like a princess. Truly, you have done a wonderful job creating a fairy tale image for this wedding." Vanessa beamed, thinking this was going to be a compliment. She sat up straighter, basking in the attention. But Eleanor continued, her voice dropping an octave, becoming sharper. "We all know that fairy tales are just stories. They aren't real. And looking at this beautiful setup tonight, I realized something very important. You see, a marriage isn't about the dress or the flowers or the fancy cake. A marriage is about trust. It is about honesty. And it is about two families coming together." She paused again, letting the silence hang in the air. The mood in the room was shifting. People could feel that something was off. The smiles were becoming a bit nervous. David stopped clapping. He looked at his mother with a tilted head, sensing a change in her energy. "David, my son," Eleanor said, turning slightly to face him, "I raised you to always tell the truth. I raised you to believe that people are good. But today, I learned a hard lesson. I learned that some people will say anything to get what they want. Even at the altar." Vanessa's smile faltered a little. She exchanged a worried glance with her mother. Eleanor reached under her jacket and pulled out the manila folder. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Eleanor opened the folder and took out the first sheet of paper. It was a photocopy of a court document. "You see, David," Eleanor said, her voice growing stronger. "Before you say I do to this family, there is something you need to know. Something I think should have been shared before we signed the marriage license today." She looked up from the paper and stared right at Vanessa's father, whose face was turning pale. "Mr. Van Cleve, you told David that you were a successful international investor. You told him you made your fortune in overseas markets." Eleanor held up the paper. "But according to these public court records from last month, you aren't an investor. You are currently being sued by the state for running a fraudulent investment scheme. You took money from elderly people who thought they were saving for their retirement. That is where your money comes from. It is not fortune, it is theft." A gasp went through the crowd. It started on one side of the room and spread like a wave. People turned in their seats to look at Vanessa's father. He stood up quickly, knocking his chair over. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, his face turning red. "You have no right." "Security." Eleanor didn't blink. She didn't stop. She pulled out another paper. "And Vanessa," she said, her voice sad but firm, "you made a comment to me today during the ceremony. You thought I didn't hear you? You said you were glad to ditch the peasant section. You said you were joining a family with class. You think you are better than me because of the clothes you wear and the car you drive?" Vanessa froze. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. She looked like a deer caught in headlights. "But your clothes are rented," Eleanor said, holding up a receipt printout. "This dress you are wearing? You didn't buy it. You rented it from a boutique in the city, just like you rented your vacation home for the photos you posted online. And that diamond necklace you are wearing? It is costume jewelry. I have the receipt right here from a wholesale costume shop. It cost $15. The room erupted in murmurs. Guests were pulling out their phones, whispering to each other. The rich friends of the Van Cleves looked horrified. Not just because of the lies, but because they realized they had been fooled too. They had been bragging about their connections to a wealthy family, only to find out the family was broke. "You see," Eleanor said, her voice echoing over the noise, "this entire wedding is a scam. My son has a trust fund. It is not millions, but it is a nice amount. And I believe the only reason Vanessa and her family agreed to this marriage is to get their hands on that money to pay off your debts." She looked at David, who was standing now, his face white as a sheet. "David," she said gently, "they are using you. They are not rich. They are drowning in debt. And today, at the altar, your new wife made it clear that she has no respect for me, and therefore no respect for you. I am so sorry to have to do this in front of everyone, but I could not let you sign your life away to a lie." Eleanor placed the microphone back on the stand with a loud thud. The sound cut through the murmurs like a knife. She looked at Vanessa one last time. Vanessa was crying now, real tears, but they were tears of humiliation and anger. She wasn't the princess anymore. She was the villain of the story. Eleanor didn't wait for a reaction. She didn't wait for David to speak. She turned and walked off the stage, her head held high. She had done what she came to do. She had ripped off the mask, and now everyone could see the ugly truth underneath. The silence that followed Eleanor's last word was not peaceful. It was heavy and suffocating, like the air before a thunderstorm. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The band had stopped playing, and even the waiters froze in place, their eyes wide as they looked from the stage to the bride's table. The only sound was the low hum of the air conditioning system, which seemed strangely loud in the quiet room. Then the dam broke. It started as a low murmur, like bees buzzing, and then grew into a loud roar of voices. Guests stood up from their chairs, craning their necks to see the reaction at the front table. People were pointing, whispering, and holding their hands over their mouths in shock. The elegant atmosphere of the wedding had shattered in an instant, replaced by the raw energy of a scandal. Vanessa was the first to move. She shot up from her chair, knocking it backward onto the floor with a loud crash that echoed through the hall. Her face, which had been perfectly painted with expensive makeup just minutes ago, was now twisted in rage and humiliation. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape, but she realized there was nowhere to go. She was trapped on a stage of her own making. "You crazy old woman." Vanessa screamed, her voice shrill and piercing. She grabbed the microphone that Eleanor had just left on the stand. "You are lying. You are just jealous because you are poor and we are successful. Security? Get her out of here." She tried to sound authoritative, like the boss she pretended to be, but her voice was shaking. The fear in her eyes was obvious. She looked like a cornered animal. Cynthia, Vanessa's mother, stood up beside her, trying to pull Vanessa away from the mic, but it was too late. The damage was done. The guests had heard the accusations. Now they were looking at the evidence in their hands. Eleanor had walked off the stage and was standing near the side wall, watching the chaos unfold. She didn't look angry anymore. She looked calm. She watched as the people she had exposed began to unravel. David was still standing at the head table. He looked like a statue that had been frozen in ice. He stared at Vanessa, then at his mother, then back at Vanessa. It was as if his brain was trying to process the information but just couldn't. He looked down at the table where a glass of red wine was sitting. Suddenly, with a sweep of his arm, he knocked the glass off the table. It shattered on the floor, sending red liquid splashing across the white tablecloth like a wound. "Is it true?" David asked. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the room because everyone else had stopped talking to listen. He looked at Vanessa, his eyes searching hers for the truth. "Vanessa, is what my mom said true? Did you mock her at the altar? And your father? The money? Is it all a lie?" Vanessa stopped shouting. She looked at David, and for a moment her mask slipped completely. The arrogance was gone, replaced by desperation. She reached out to grab his arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. "Baby, no," she said, her voice switching from screaming to pleading in a second. "She's crazy. She's making it up because she hates that we are happy. You know me? You know I love you. We talked about this. She's just a bitter, lonely old lady." David pulled his arm away from her as if her touch burned him. "Don't call her that," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "My mother is the most honest person I know. And she showed us papers, Vanessa. Legal papers. I saw them. You don't get court summons printed on a home computer." He turned to look at Vanessa's father. The man was sweating profusely. He was tugging at his collar, looking around the room nervously. He didn't say a word. He just looked down at his plate, avoiding eye contact with everyone. That silence was an answer louder than any shout. It was the admission of guilt. David let out a long, shuddering breath. He looked at the woman he was supposed to spend the rest of his life with. He remembered all the times she had made fun of his clothes, or his car, or his mother's cooking. He had laughed it off, thinking she was just joking. But now, he realized she wasn't joking. She actually looked down on him. She was using him, the trust fund, David said, his voice barely a whisper. That's why you wanted to rush the wedding, isn't it? You needed the money. No, David, please. Vanessa cried, tears now streaming down her face, ruining her makeup. I love you. The money doesn't matter. But David wasn't listening anymore. He reached up to his left lapel and roughly ripped off the white boutonniere that matched Vanessa's bouquet. He threw it onto the table. It landed on top of the spilled wine, soaking up the red liquid. I can't do this, David said, his voice shaking with emotion. I won't do this. I won't be part of a lie. And I certainly won't let you treat my mother like dirt. He turned and walked away from the head table. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as he walked through the room. He didn't run. He walked with his head high, looking straight ahead. He walked right past his mother, Eleanor. He stopped for a split second, looked her in the eye, and gave her a small, sad nod. It was a look of gratitude. It was a look that said, "Thank you for saving me." Then he kept walking. Right out the double doors of the banquet hall, Vanessa collapsed into her chair, sobbing uncontrollably. Cynthia was screaming at the guests, telling them to leave, telling them they didn't understand, but nobody was listening to her. The rich friends of the Van Cleve family were already grabbing their purses and coats. They were hurrying toward the exits, whispering among themselves. They were scared. If the Van Cleves were being sued for fraud, they didn't want to be associated with them. They didn't want people to think they were involved in the scam. The room emptied out surprisingly fast. Within 10 minutes, half the guests were gone. The ones who remained were mostly David's family and friends who gathered around Eleanor. Giving her hugs and whispering words of support, Eleanor stood by the wall, watching the staff begin to clear the untouched food. It was a tragic sight. The beautiful wedding cake stood untouched, a symbol of a celebration that never really happened. The band members were packing up their instruments. Looking uncomfortable and sorry for the family, Vanessa's father finally stood up. He didn't look at his daughter. He didn't look at Cynthia. He just put his hands in his pockets and walked toward the side exit, disappearing into the night like a thief in the night. He left his wife and daughter to deal with the mess he had created. Cynthia sat down next to her sobbing daughter, looking defeated. Her expensive dress suddenly looked very tacky under the harsh fluorescent lights that the staff had turned on. The magic of the event was gone, leaving only the harsh reality of their greed. Eleanor watched them for a moment. She didn't feel happy. She didn't feel like celebrating. She felt a deep sense of sadness for David. His wedding day was supposed to be one of the happiest days of his life, and it had turned into a disaster. But as she looked at Vanessa and Cynthia, huddled together in shame, she knew she had done the right thing. Pain now was better than a lifetime of lies later. She adjusted her jacket and picked up her handbag. She knew David was outside waiting for her. She walked toward the door, her shoes clicking on the hard floor. As she pushed the door open and stepped out into the cool night air, she left the chaos behind. The fake world of the Van Cleves had collapsed, and in the wreckage, the truth was finally visible. It was a hard way to learn a lesson, but David was free. And that was all that mattered. The night air outside the banquet hall was cool and crisp, sharp contrast to the hot, stuffy mess Eleanor had just left behind. The parking lot was nearly empty. Most of the guests had hurriedly driven away, eager to escape the drama and gossip, their tires crunching loudly on the gravel as they sped off. The fancy limousine that the bride and groom were supposed to take to a luxury hotel was still parked near the entrance. The driver standing outside smoking a cigarette, looking confused, Eleanor walked slowly across the dark pavement. Her feet hurt from standing in her heels for so long, but she felt a sense of lightness in her chest. The weight she had been carrying for months, the secret, the worry, the suspicion was finally gone. She had dropped the bomb, and even though the explosion was messy, the lies had been destroyed. She found David sitting on the hood of her car. He had taken off his tuxedo jacket and tie and threw them on the ground next to him. He was looking down at his hands, clasped together tightly. Under the streetlights, Eleanor could see that his eyes were red and puffy. He looked smaller than usual, like a little boy who had lost his favorite toy. It broke Eleanor's heart to see him like this, but she knew that this pain was necessary. It was the pain of healing, the kind of pain that comes when a wound is finally cleaned out. Eleanor walked up to him and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. He didn't look up at first. He just kept staring at the ground. "David," she said softly. "It's time to go home." David flinched slightly, then looked up. His face was a mixture of sadness and relief. "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Did I really almost marry that? Was I that blind?" Eleanor moved closer and sat down on the hood of the car next to him. The metal was cold through her dress. "You weren't blind, honey. You were in love," she said, her voice full of motherly warmth. "And you are a good person. You trust people. You assume everyone has a heart as good as yours. That is not a weakness, David. That is a beautiful thing. But there are people in this world who see that kindness as a weakness they can use." He let out a long, shaky breath and leaned his head on her shoulder. It was a gesture he hadn't done since he was a child. "I feel so stupid," he admitted. "She said those things about you. At the altar. How could I have loved someone so cruel?" "It is hard to see the truth when you are caught up in the fairy tale," Eleanor said, stroking his hair gently. "She painted a picture for you. She wanted you to see her as a princess, and she wanted me to be the wicked stepmother. But you saw the real her today, and you stood up for me. You walked away. That makes me prouder of you than any degree or job ever could." They sat there for a long time in the silence of the parking lot. The limousine driver eventually got the hint, got back in his car, and drove away, leaving the exhaust fumes to fade into the night. The lights of the banquet hall flickered off as the staff shut everything down. "It's marking the end of the worst wedding in history." "Let's go home," Eleanor said after a while. "We can stop for some ice cream. I think we both need a big bowl of something sweet." A small smile tugged at the corner of David's mouth. "Chocolate?" he asked. "Double chocolate," Eleanor replied. The drive home was quiet, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was a peaceful silence. When they got to Eleanor's small house, it felt like a sanctuary. The air didn't smell of expensive perfume and secrets. It smelled like lavender detergent and home. David took a shower and changed into his old sweatpants, while Eleanor made hot cocoa. They sat at the kitchen table, just like they used to do when he was a boy, talking late into the night. The days that followed were not easy. The news of the wedding disaster spread through their town like wildfire. People called, neighbors whispered over fences, and for a while David felt like he couldn't show his face in public. But Eleanor stood by him, reminding him that the shame belonged to the Van Cleves, not to him. As for Vanessa and her family, the fallout was massive and real. Because Eleanor had exposed the fraud in such a public way, the authorities took immediate interest. It turned out that the investment scheme Vanessa's father was running was even bigger than Eleanor had thought. Within a few weeks, the police were involved. Vanessa's father was arrested and charged with multiple counts of fraud. The story even made the local news. The wealthy family lost everything. Their house was seized, their cars were repossessed, and the fancy clothes were sold off to pay back the people they had cheated. Vanessa tried to call David a few times. She left crying voicemails, begging for forgiveness, claiming she was forced into it by her parents. But David never answered. He knew that while her parents might have been the masterminds, Vanessa was a willing participant. She had mocked his mother. She had lied to his face. That was not something you just forgive. He changed his phone number and deleted his social media accounts to cut ties completely. He wanted nothing to do with their toxicity. A year passed, and life moved on. The scar from the wedding faded, turning into just a story David would tell when people asked about his past. He threw himself into his work, and slowly the color returned to his cheeks. He started smiling again, a real smile that reached his eyes. One sunny afternoon, David brought a girl home to meet Eleanor. Her name was Clara. She wasn't a supermodel, and she didn't wear designer clothes. She was a kindergarten teacher with a warm laugh and kind eyes. She drove a practical car and lived in a modest apartment. When they sat down for dinner, Clara didn't check her phone once. She asked Eleanor about her garden. She listened to David's stories. She helped clear the table without being asked. When Clara went to the bathroom, David looked at his mother with a grin. "Well," he asked, "what do you think?" Eleanor looked toward the hallway where Clara had gone, then back at her son. She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "I think," she said, her eyes shining, "that she is the real deal. No masks, no lies, just a good heart." Later that evening, as Eleanor stood on her porch, waving goodbye to the young couple, she felt a deep sense of peace. The moon was full and bright, casting a silver glow over her garden. She thought back to that horrible day at the altar, the day her world almost turned dark. But because she had found the courage to speak up, she had saved her son's future. She realized that family isn't about the money you have or the fancy parties you throw. It is about the truth. It is about protecting the people you love, even when protecting them hurts. Eleanor wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself and smiled at the quiet night. The nightmare with the Van Cleves was over, and a new, happier chapter had finally begun. She had unmasked the villains, and in doing so, she had helped her son find his way back to a life that was real, honest, and truly his own.